Massa agus fáilte go dtí an cruinniú poibli seo den údarás póilíneachta leis Commissioner agus a go leacathe. Nuair a hangamar le chéile den céadúir mar seo bliana hain níor ceapéine gur mar seo bheith míad inis fós. Ach sin mar atá agus ní fis fós gaimid ag teachta céile I dteannta céile. Ach deis céile tá going inniuh mar tá mid a chur fáilte rih Las Commissioner nua an Garda Síochána tá tag hen an haar farga cóing an áil haar farga cóing ó Canada Las Commissioner Seána Coxon tá fáilte rimpi agus guimid gach ráthairí. Good afternoon and you're very welcome to this meeting of the Policing Authority held in public with the Commissioner and his colleagues, the second such meeting this year. None of us could have envisaged when we came together in this distanced fashion for the first time a little over a year ago that we would still be meeting in this way, but that's the way it is, and it's unclear yet when we might be able to meet physically together in public with access to members of the public at our meetings. But let us hope it will not be too far in the distance from us. A particular pleasure today is to welcome the new Deputy Commissioner of the Garda Síochána, Dr. Seána Coxon, who joins the Garda Síochána from her previous role as Assistant Chief of Police in Toronto in Canada. You're very welcome, Seána, and we wish you. So I will begin. And the first item on our agenda, Commissioner, is the question of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Babies' Homes. We've touched upon this at a number of meetings in terms of the way in which the Garda Síochána could engage with people, and also today perhaps you might say something about your evaluation of the report following the request of the government that you evaluated, and what possibilities arise for the Garda Síochána in relation to it, if any.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chair. And also, if I could just take a second to welcome Deputy Commissioner Seána Coxon as well. Obviously, this is her first public meeting with the authority, but it's a very important addition to our leadership team, and we all very much look forward to working with her. And she brings immense experience both in terms of policing and organisational change, and obviously from a different jurisdiction as well. So that is very welcome indeed, and we look forward to Seána's input in the months and years ahead. Turn now to the, as asked, to the mother and baby homes. We were asked in the 30th of October to look at the report and consider then what we might do, and obviously our responsibility then is in terms of crime investigation. We have studied that report, and it is a harrowing and disturbing read, and it does cover a period of some 98 years as well, and it outlines the conditions which obviously were prevalent in Ireland, but also then obviously in the mother and baby homes. And in response to that, we believe it is appropriate to say that people who were affected by this, either in terms of the pregnancy, and obviously there are reports of rape, there are reports of children as young as 12 being pregnant and admitted to mother and baby homes. So even though the criminal law has changed over the intervening 98 years that this report covers, there may well be yet matters which we can subject to, in effect, a crime investigation towards a criminal justice outcome. I would point to our experience, and quite significant experience, in dealing with historic cases of sex abuse and abuse, and that we have significant experience that we can bring to bear in this respect. And also then now for the first time in the last year, we have protective service bureaus throughout the country who are specialists in terms of dealing with such complaints, and we have a National Protective Services Bureau to coordinate matters. If I turn to AC John O'Driscoll, and John can set out just the specific steps that we are taking in terms of the contact that we can have with those who might wish to make complaints, and the service that we would set out to provide right from the outset. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Commissioner. John.
Good afternoon, Chair, and to all who are listening. Yes, I suppose we're fortunate that in terms of the Garda Síochána response, we now have a bureau, which is the Garda National Protective Services Bureau, which is dedicated to accommodating and reacting to issues involving vulnerable victims. And of course, as the Commissioner has described, we're talking about very vulnerable people who have been abused in an horrific manner in terms of what is disclosed in the report. So we have personnel within that bureau who are skilled and trained to take statements and to interview people who are the victims of the types of crime that is concerned here. And we have established a dedicated email address to which we've already received some information and requests from people for us to interact with them. And that is motherandbabyhome@garda.ie. And that is manned by personnel within that bureau, where investigations can take place. And in some cases, it won't be possible because maybe those in respect of whom allegations have been made may be deceased. But where they can take place, we have also the facility now of utilising personnel throughout the country in the Detective Service Protection units located in each of the Garda Síochána divisions, who are also trained to deal with matters such as those that arise here. We have a dedicated phone line, of course, child sexual abuse reporting phone line, 1-800-555, and that can also and is also used in circumstances such as this. And indeed, some people have chosen and may wish to, into the future, go to a Garda station, report directly at a Garda station to bring to our notice issues that are of concern to them. But I suppose in the current COVID pandemic-related circumstances, that may prove problematic even for those who would wish to choose that mechanism. The mother and baby's home at garda.ie email address is one I think that is I would recommend because it will get the emails received, will get the appropriate consideration with speed and a reaction in terms of making a contact, so that those concerned will be assured that we will do whatever it is within our capacity to do. And of course, we cannot promise any more than that, particularly with the remove from the events that will be reported upon. So we would encourage people to contact us and to utilise those facilities to convey to us their concerns for us to react in an appropriate manner to them.
Thank you, Assistant Commissioner O'Driscoll. I suppose it's important to say that, or is it that the report is anonymised in terms of the people whose harrowing stories are told. And although people will readily recognise themselves in terms of the stories that they've told, third parties won't be able to recognise them, and that it's important, therefore, that people take account of that and not feel that everybody else will know as they do that this is their story and therefore this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And may I ask one other question on this, either to you, Commissioner, or to John? Is there anything on the face of the report, as you've seen it, that enables the Garda Síochána to respond of it at its own initiative, as it were, in relation to any breaches of the law or whatever that you may have discerned from it, or does it depend entirely on individuals coming forward to you with specific indications of issues they wish to have investigated?
I think in a in the first place, really, when one looks at the report, it is anonymised, and it covers a period really from very early 20s right through to 1998. And so even though situations are described, which are obviously a description of crime, they're anonymised and cannot be placed really. If they can be placed in a physical location, it's very difficult to place them within a time scale, etc. So from reading the reports, it only takes us so far. It obviously, and that's why we're making this appeal today, it gives us a very definite apprehension that serious criminality was engaged either in terms of the women and girls who were pregnant, and then their subsequent stay in the mother and baby homes. And almost 20% of those girls who stayed in the mother and baby homes were under the age of 18. So there's initial very significant concern, but there's also issues in terms of their mental vulnerability, and also then indications of incest, rape, and what would now be called statutory rape. There are various hurdles that we will have to cross in terms of just what the criminal law was at that particular time, but at the same time, we want people to come forward, and if they feel they have a complaint to make or an issue to raise with us, then we can deal with those each in turn, and at least be able to either investigate and report that matter then to the Director of Public Prosecutions, or at the very least explain why having done that, the prosecution is not likely to succeed. There is a passage of time here. Persons of interest, even suspects, may have died. Indeed, victims, witnesses may have died as well, and also then records may no longer be in existence. So this is a difficult scenario, and decades have passed in terms of some of the events, which are particularly harrowing within the report. But at the same time, there may still be those who are alive who suffered criminality, and we would say to them, please come forward and make a complaint, or approach us at least, and let us speak to you.
Thank you very much. And I should, did you wish to say something, John?
I would just add that we are also working hand in hand with TUSLA, the family, Child and Family Agency, and we have a joint strategy plan so that we will ensure that where the two agencies need to work together in reacting to anything that we're told, that will happen. And we will both communicate through our press offices and our communication centres with the public to convey the necessary information to the public.
Thank you for that, Assistant Commissioner. And I'm sure that although, as you say, given the times we live in, it would be better if people communicated with you through the email address or telephone numbers that you have given and that will be publicised by you. If people do go attend at their local Garda stations, I presume that appropriate arrangements will be made so that they will be met sensitively and with the degree of privacy and confidentiality that the circumstances warrant.
Yes, that they will be put in contact with the appropriate people who will be skilled in terms of dealing with these issues.
Thank you very much for that. We're now going to move on to the next item, which is policing performance matters. And Maureen Ryan is going to lead off on this on the policing plan review of performance, and subsequently Paul McGeehan on policing during COVID-19. And we have about 30 minutes for this session. Maureen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioner and colleagues. We've already commended the improved quality of the reporting against the significant number of objectives and targets that are set out in the policing plan, both substantively and indeed visually. This is now the end of the quarter with the reports. The most recent report that we've got is up to the end of March. So it's a particular timeline which it might be useful to take stock. So if I might invite you, Commissioner, to share with us what you feel has gone particularly well for Garda Síochána in the first quarter, recognising that you've been operating in unprecedented circumstances and that a number of the targets that you've set for the year have had to be parked during this period where staff had to be directed elsewhere. What matters that you feel have gone particularly well, and also I'd like you to share with us areas that you feel may have been a source of disappointment, or where you anticipated that the level of your achievements might have been greater than actually turned out to be the case.
Okay, thank you. I think I would have to say internally we're very pleased with some of the notable progresses that we've made in the first quarter, and so one of the principal areas I would point to would be in respect of our response to domestic abuse over the last year since we started our specific Operation Suisive. And in respect of this, on the 1st of April 2020, we've had over 28,500 reconnects with victims of domestic abuse. And that's been important because our 7-day compliance rate for March was at 83%. So that's a very, very considerable improvement from where we were 2 years ago. And we've said throughout the COVID pandemic, it's just not been about COVID. It's also been in respect of protecting the public from domestic abuse, protecting the public from organised crime, but also providing community reassurance. And so we've kept on a focus in that regard as well. We've had the go live of the Schengen system, SIS2 as it's known as, and that initially, even from the very first day, started to give us significant successes in that we located an individual in Europe who's wanted for serious crime here in Ireland, literally within hours of it opening, and that success has carried on, and we're playing our full part in terms of the safety and security of citizens, not only here in Ireland, but in the rest of Europe. And so that's been important. Recently, we've also seen the publication of the general scheme of the operating model bill. And so that moves into legislation and necessary building blocks to allow us to move forward with the, in effect, operation of the operating model in local areas. So allow us to move to divisions. The district model, in effect, has been subsumed by this operating model bill, and we can move on then to the division being the unit, the basic unit of delivery of the policing function here in Ireland. So all of that has been very important. Internally here, we're very pleased to be able to announce an internship program. So that's both for school leavers and those who have attained degrees. We're directing that towards groups that do not have perhaps a history of employment in Garda Síochána. And so we see that as a real opening for us in terms of increasing the diversity and talent within the organisation. And we'll be offering up to 11 months employment as an intern. It's paid internship within, and it'll be a really good program, because probably I think what people don't realise is the amount of functions there are within Garda Síochána. So there's plenty of space there in terms of the finance function, human resources function, vehicle management, building management, as well as the other administrative functions that go on. So we have plenty of space for bringing interns in and skilling them up in the workplace, and then obviously then being able to provide them with a reference if they as they begin their careers. We have a health and well-being strategy finalised and to be delivered to the organisation. That was part of the Commission of Future Policing, and it's very important when set against the backdrop of the pandemic. And also then we've continued on with our own work to prevent corruption within the organisation, and that's been supported then by the publication of the Inspectorate's report. And I have to respond to the Minister in terms of each of those recommendations. But very much we are in the same place as the Inspectorate and facing the same direction. You did comment upon some of the targets which have been greyed out because of COVID and the initial demand there was in the first 3 months of the year on us in terms of managing the COVID restrictions. And we're now starting to review and where we can recommence those. So piloting the local community safety partnership in 3 divisions, Dublin North East, Waterford and Longford, and also then starting to apply the human rights screening tool to key areas, including use of force, use of Garda vehicles in pursuit, our victims of crime policy, custody management and public order. So there's a lot of work going on. We very much have had a big support role in terms of the government approach to managing the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has meant that some of our organisational development undoubtedly has fallen behind, but the emergency necessitated of that. And but despite that, I'm very pleased in the progress we've already made this year, and then how we hope to open those up over the next year. I suppose the residual things that I'd be concerned about is just we have our recruitment over the last year hasn't been at the numbers that we expected, and that creates a tail in terms of just catching up and getting to our number of 15,000. And also then there's a big tail in terms of training. A lot of what we do does require training. The COVID-19 has necessitated us using online training and being pretty innovative about that, and innovative also about the student training. That's probably a good thing. And when we compress about 3 years development into as many weeks in developing that, so in the end that is positive, but we do have a considerable training overhead that we're going to have to address over the next 12 to 24 months. Otherwise, I would point to, I think, the strong relationship that we have with the community. I would point to the confidence measure that was reported in respect of Garda Síochána of some 83%, which we feel is very significant. And we ourselves then this year hope to commence our public attitude surveys, which we will be able then to disaggregate down to divisional level. So that'll give us a finer analysis of how well we're doing across the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, Paul will be dealing in some detail in relation to COVID policing, but there's inevitably going to be something of an overlap between the two areas. And one issue that interests me is the easing of the regulations, so the anticipated easing of regulations in terms of travel. Even the most recent ones has probably meant that the redeployment of resources from various priority areas can now be retracted, can now be moved again and brought back. And what I'd be interested in is what has been the impact or the extent of the impact of the most recent easing of the regulations. I won't ask you to anticipate because we've got to wait the announcement later today. But what has happened in the past week? Have you made plans in relation to where you're going to reallocate or reassign the resources, and how many of those resources have there been?
So internally and through February and into March, and just to and really coming out of the very critical period of January into mid-February, we started to make decisions about the future deployment of personnel, and you will see from our report there that personnel were withheld from certain national units, and those national units have since received those personnel. So notably anti-corruption unit, but also the Economic Crime Bureau as well, and the Cyber Crime Bureau. So all of that has recommenced. Personnel moved on the 22nd of March. Some training recommenced on the 22nd of March as well, particularly student training, but also then driver training, firearms training. So we've had to, we can't keep all the stops closed just months and months. It just takes so long to catch up, and it does actually erode some of the capability within the organisation. So we've responded that to already. The present change to the county plus 20 kilometres, these are not easy regulations to place. They because in effect you may have to stop many vehicles before you find an individual who's beyond their county plus 20k from their home place. But what we have been doing is trying to regulate movement of people to either to the seaside or to places of natural beauty, etc., where big crowds have been developing over the last number of weekends. And some of what we're dealing with now, I think, would be more accurately described as public order as much as it is COVID-19 policing. And so we're very aware that we've a bank holiday weekend coming. We expect many of the policing issues that we expect of any bank holiday weekend. We will have a focus, obviously, on COVID-19, but I'd have to say also have a focus around public order issues, but particularly also road safety issues. And where in the past our checkpoints would have been focused on COVID-19, we are going to restart the mid checkpoints, particularly into the afternoon, evening and nighttime, to detect those who may be driving under the influence of drink or drugs. So we are in effect also transitioning back to our normal policing stance around the various targets we have in the policing plan and our priorities around, in effect, keeping people safe.
Just one or two further questions, Commissioner. Are you in a position to share with us the extent of the resources that you had to assign to unanticipated COVID policing? And are you in a position? I know you were able to utilize some of the Gardaí or who were in the course of training in Templemore. And how many have you been in a position to reassign as a consequence of the most recent easing of regulations?
I couldn't give you that figure over the top off the top of my head, but I can report on because we have all the figures around the recommencement of training, which it also engages in training staff, and also then allowing transfers for the various national units, and the recommencement of some of the divisional work as well. So you are, in effect, really everybody that we could mobilise for operational purposes was mobilised, and that created a great footprint and presence, uniform, visible presence on the ground. And now, as other functions have opened up, that will have diminished. At the same time, we still have a good footprint out in the ground and visibility, and we are anxious to maintain that. But I can get the precise numbers for you, but it runs into the hundreds and hundreds actually. When I count it up in my head, but I don't want to give a figure because I think that would be.
I just really wanted to people to appreciate the significance of the impact on resourcing. A final area, if I might, Commissioner. I don't anticipate propose going into the detail of detection rates under various headings, but I am interested in the detections improvement plan, and I'm interested in the extent to which the detections improvement plan, which was designed to implement a uniform approach to investigation and governance and investigation standards, ultimately to improve the detection rates. But I'm interested in to what extent that plan is still operational and how central it is to the approach that's taken to detections within the force.
Okay, well, I can say it is integral to our work. It's connected very closely to the investigation management system, but it's also connected closely to some of the changes that we're making onto the operating model, in particular around the flow of intelligence. And you'll see within our reporting that we've rolled out the new intelligence model in the Eastern region, and that is subject now to, in effect, examination in the field and review and evaluation as to how it's working. But if I might turn to Anne-Marie McMahon in terms of the actual plan and its further implementation, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon. So the detection improvement plan, I suppose it would be fair to say and acknowledge that that particular plan, as was originally envisaged, probably took a little bit of a backseat last year in some regards because of the I suppose the requirement to bring pretty much everybody front-facing supporting the government and the Department of Health in terms of policing COVID. That said, there was still considerable detections made, particularly in relation to drugs and organised crime. And there were also very significant detections made across lower levels of drug dealing. In terms of the actual plan and its prevalence and the consistency that you speak about, so through the regional ACs meetings, there's a sharing of best practice and an opportunity to, I suppose, share among each of the regional ACs what's happening in their area and how they can support each other. A key feature of the detection improvement plan, is first of all, I suppose, being out and about and in the first instance, being proactive and detecting crime as it happens. That happens on some occasions. It doesn't happen on all occasions. And then subsequent to that, then there's a process of ongoing review, a process that we call Operation Look Back within the detection improvement plan. And there are various, I suppose, degrees of success within that. And at the moment, we're reviewing its effectiveness in terms of the consistency of application. But it is fair to say that it is central to the whole, I suppose, approach to detections. And again, as we move out of COVID, I anticipate that the focus on that particular improvement plan will come to the fore again.
And that was exactly going to be my final question in terms of review. To what extent is it an appraisal of the impact, and that's something that we will come back to in a future meeting. So if I might, without further ado, pass to Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. Good afternoon, Commissioner and colleagues. I wanted to ask a question, Commissioner, really following up from what Maureen asked in relation to the situation as we perhaps move away from the worst of COVID. And I think when you look back at the last year, obviously it's been quite exceptional in terms of the effort that the Gardaí have had to put in and the resources that you've had to put into the policing of COVID, and indeed exceptional powers, I suppose, that have been granted to the Guards. And just as an example, I read recently that there were 210,000 checkpoints since last May. As we're beginning to move back towards, as you said, transitioning back towards the normal policing stance, I wondered, could you give us an update on one of the exceptional measures that has been introduced in the last year, and that's the introduction of spit hoods. And as you're well aware, at this stage, the authority wasn't alone in expressing grave concerns about their introduction and their use, and we've been closely monitoring their use over the last year. When we look at our most recent report to the Minister, it's quite clear that the number of occasions on which they're used has reduced quite dramatically in the last couple of months, which I suppose reflects the improving situation. But I just wonder, I know obviously there's been an evaluation process, but I just wonder, can you tell us, in light of what you yourself have described as the transitioning back towards a normal policing stance, when might they be discontinued?
Well, maybe when might just be just exactly where I am, as opposed to how they're used and who they're issued to. I think I have committed to a further examination of this and coming towards a final decision on the 30th of September. So the anti-spit guards are a piece of protective equipment, and they provide in terms of health and safety of members from those who would spit at them. They were introduced, I think, against a particular prevalence of spitting attacks in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thankfully, the number of those has substantially reduced. Now we literally, I think there was only 3 uses in March. So taking that into account, taking the fact of what they are and the controversy around them, then I do think their present use has to come under very serious consideration. But whether that's a complete withdrawal or partial withdrawal, we've yet to determine. But I'm very conscious of just the disquiet there is in respect of them, and we've sought to try and explain their use as much as possible. But I would say that even from the statistics that I see, it's not that every time that guards are spat at, that the spit hood is then used. But there is things from the report that we want to be sure of around the recommendations around their issue, their training, the accountability of them, and then what members are issued with them. So I don't think I can commit today to a complete withdrawal of them, but I have committed to a further review based on the 30th of September, and that date is really based on our exceptional view of the present situation continues to then in terms of the roster that we have, etc. So that gives us a natural date for which to consider that, and we'll have in effect almost a year and a half's data on their use and circumstances of their use, and that will dictate then what their future might be in Garda Síochána.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up in relation to that aspect in particular? And it's, I mean, I think we both accept that they were introduced, as you've just said, as a response to the pandemic. And I'm just trying to envisage circumstances that might justify their retention beyond the pandemic. I mean, whether the authority agree or not with their introduction, I can see that there was a context in which they were introduced, and you've referred to it yourself now, but what possible circumstances might justify their retention beyond the end of the pandemic?
Well, I think we need to see just what happens over the next few months in terms of the incidents of spitting or assaults on members of Garda Síochána. They have been in relatively low numbers now for a number of months, in effect, and the use of them has been in relatively low as well in terms of just single figures. And so the question for me is that, in effect, they're on pretty uniform issue right across the organisation to all uniform members, in effect. And whether that is necessary going forward would be a live consideration of this. And then just to consider, if they're not on, in effect, uniform issue, then do we have specialist groups then that might have them in their for their use, and who can then receive specific training about their use, but also then the welfare of a detained person who has an anti-spit guard fitted on them. So I think there's more. I think there's more to do here before just say to withdraw them again completely, because they are in effect as regard health and safety protection, piece of personal protective equipment. They are regarded as a use of force, obviously, whenever one is used, and they're subject to stringent reporting. And I'm not at a place where I would say on the 30th of September we will withdraw them. At this moment in time, I just want to take the time to review the next few months and what it means for us to have them or not have them, or to limit their issue going forward.
Okay, thanks for that, and we look forward to coming back to that and re-engaging perhaps closer to that date. Okay. You'll be aware that during the course of the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of engagement. The executive of the authority has been doing a lot of engagement with civic society and various community groups, etc. And one of the issues, I mean, while the bulk of the feedback to us in relation to policing has been positive, one of the themes of concern that has emerged occasionally has been a concern around inconsistencies in policing. And in that context, I just wondered whether or not you would want to comment on the policing of the events at Salt Hill last weekend, when there were a considerable number of people on the beach and in the town, and the policing of that vis-a-vis the disruption to the Latin Mass that was taking place in Athlone.
Well, you have to regard, I think, the Salt Hill incident in terms of a public order incident as much as, and obviously within the COVID restrictions and regulations, many people were certainly outside of their particular pods or groups of people that they should have been associated with. And so there was an element of certainly drunkenness there, and that was, and as I've said earlier, like some of this is more about public order as opposed to it is to the regulations. But I don't think we're really comparing apples with apples there. You know, to intervene in the Salt Hill situation, you need to make sure that you've got sufficient resources that you can deal effectively with what's in front of you, and that might mean that you have to make a number of arrests. The issue with indoor events, and I won't refer specifically to that, but if I just talk about indoor events, indoor events create their own risks in themselves, just because we all understand from scientific advice, indoor events create so much more risk. Now, we're applying the regulations as we believe they should be applied in terms of a public safety message. The events in Salt Hill, undoubtedly there was a public safety element there, but I think that was outweighed by actually the public order element. And I think the Garda on scene dealt with what they found as appropriately as they could given their resourcing level. But we faced similar situations, but just they didn't get as much coverage in terms of crowds throughout the country. And we dealt very successfully with large groups drinking here in Dublin and other locations as well. But just the afternoon that it was and the events that happened unfolded, and we weren't able to bring the resources to bear to, in effect, deal with a public order situation.
Okay, and finally from me, and because I think we're pressed for time slightly, but as part of the outreach that we've been doing, as I said, generally speaking, the response has been quite positive. In our most recent report, we referred to, however, quite a marked deterioration in the feedback that we were getting from students, and I have to say it's students in one particular area who reported quite aggressive policing, aggressive interaction with individual members of the Guards, unjustified and perhaps unlawful entering of houses. I know it's difficult to respond to sort of generalized allegations like that, but are you aware of that deterioration in relationships, and is there anything you would want to say to reassure the student leaders that we were engaging with?
Well, what I would say is that when we look at January and February and the deep crisis that we were in terms of COVID, and then the behaviours that we were finding, and I won't say students, but we were finding young people were engaged in terms of either house parties, I don't actually know the location you're referring to whenever students from one particular university, but some students actually engaged not only in breach of COVID, but also other breaches of or breaches of criminal law in terms of possession of drugs. Vehicles were seized in various locations as well, and gave us all sorts of policing issues, and that's regretted. But that behaviour wasn't universal throughout the country, and I do think some students should need to ask themselves a question, really, given the crisis that we faced, their behaviour was entirely irresponsible, and we had to, and were obliged to police that in response to public concern and public complaints, and also what the government required of us. So I can't answer the specific allegations, but don't make any particular apologies for dealing with situations which we regarded to be high risk and necessary to combat and just in terms of overall public safety during the pandemic. And I think like now in April here, you know, when you stretch your mind back to January and the real sort of crisis that we faced and the pressure there was on us around the management of the regulations and management behaviour within the regulations, or the policing of the regulations, then that did put a lot of pressure on us to respond to various complaints and try and bring in behaviour, which probably became prevalent in the run up to Christmas, to try and bring that behaviour back into some form of compliance with regulations.
Yeah, I have to say just briefly in response to that, Commissioner, that I mean these reports that we received were relatively recent. They were from student leaders that we've engaged with previously who had given quite positive reports of the policing of their area. And they specifically stated that the actions that they were complaining of were not taken in response to large-scale parties or breaches of the public health regulations, but were rather just seemed to be a marked deterioration in the attitude of Gardaí. But I mean, I think this might be something that we'll engage on further. I mean, I think we probably are pressed for time today, but I think to be fair to those individuals, these weren't reflecting, I think, the actions of students as you've described them. I'm sure there may have been individual actions like that, but these were people who I think have adopted a responsible attitude to engagement with the Guards over the last 12 months. But thank you. I'll hand back to the Chair.
Thank you, Paul. The next item for this afternoon is the issue of community safety and keeping people safe. And I just wanted to say a few brief introductory words about this because it's a topic to which we're giving and to which we will give considerable prominence today and in the future. And it follows on effectively, I suppose, from the trajectory of the entire existence of the authority, but very particularly over the last 18, 24 months, when there was a very special focus on young people, children in the context of the juvenile diversion programme issues, where the issues of violence against women were so prominently a feature of surveys, important court proceedings, the reported experiences of a wide variety of women who spoke out last year. In that context, also the importance of the work of Operation Fuishiv in the context of domestic violence, the issue of hate crime, increasing incidents of reported incidents of racist attacks, the Garda Síochána's identification of a definition of hate crime in advance of the legislation, and now the steps that are being taken in relation to that. And the importance of that feeling safe can have for the quality of people's lives. There's also the issue of the transition between now and the new oversight arrangements, which will follow the enactment of the legislation, the draft scheme of which was approved by government a couple of days ago. And the fact that although that new architecture and those new arrangements with community safety policing partnerships may have really significant benefit to communities, it will be some time before they come into effect. And there's an urgency of now in relation to the fact that for very many people, their lives are seriously affected by criminality and by the fact that they don't feel safe. We hear, regrettably, references to the term gangland too often. In my view, in the media, there is no such place as gangland. There are communities who are trying to live their lives as well as they can and whose areas have been infiltrated and taken over by criminal gangs who choose to use them as their theatres of operations. And the challenge for society, not just for the Garda Síochána, to address that issue, to see if there is a way in which people can begin again to feel safe in their own areas, whether it's remotely realistic that the elimination of drug dealing from streets could be a policy aspiration or a policing aspiration. And this is the context of, as I say, the trajectory of the past, but also the reality of the present and the priorities for the future. And important in all of this is the role of community policing, and your own comments, Commissioner, in the introduction to the 2021 policing plan, in which you speak about that philosophy of community policing being at the heart of the organisation's approach, and the innovation and agility of the last year being the bedrock in which the way forward will be built. Extremely welcome expressions of commitment in that respect. So that's the context, and Debbie is going to open on this one.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Commissioner and colleagues. The Chair has just set out some of the strategic context for a discussion and a conversation on community safety and what it will look like in the future. Commissioner, can you just maybe tell us about your vision for what community safety means to you? And when you say keeping people safe, what does that mean?
Well, if in the first place, keeping people safe, that is actually, and I suppose our guiding principle. Like whatever we do, and then we should be thinking about all our decisions, both internally and the policies that we write. What is this doing to improve the safety of people here in Ireland? And it's just as simple a term as that. But then within that, we have looked at what the threats are, and as I've said before, crime does discriminate. Crime does affect those who are most vulnerable in our society. It doesn't fall on us all equally, and we have to respond to actually where the harm is in society. And that's why we've concentrated on areas around domestic abuse. We've concentrated further around human trafficking. We're building up our resources in terms of cybercrime, but that's also to combat the abuse, the sexual abuse of children online. So there's lots of areas where there's real harm happening in our society, and we need to be there to make sure that we are protecting people. And I think that's just like our, in effect, our guiding star in all of this. Now, community safety, I think, should have a pretty wide definition that takes it out beyond policing, because community safety is also about the aspirations that people might have, and that's about education and about jobs and about their feelings about the society in which they live. And some of our problems, some of our most difficult problems, are about generational involvement in crime, and what we need to do is actually break that cycle, and that some of that is actually, a good deal of that is actually beyond the power of policing. We've had very good initiatives here in Ireland that are focused on particular locations and particular areas. They have worked and seem to have worked well and been well evaluated. But I think what the challenge is that those areas get a lot of focus. They get a lot of people with energy and maybe resources to bring to bear in respect of community safety. But how then are we going to do this across, in effect, every division and every council? And how are we going to work with all the local community safety partnerships? What other partners are going to be in the room other than policing, and what can they bring to the table as well? Because we obviously have our juvenile diversion, but there's just generally a youth diversion into something more positive in life, and that is in part youth services, part education, and part availability of gainful and meaningful employment. And I suppose with respect, a good deal of that is actually belong beyond the remit or the powers of Garda Síochána. So I don't think community safety should be defined in the terms of just what policing can do. It could be wide in the wider sense of, in effect, the well-being of a particular area in terms of just how well it's doing overall. I suppose my particular concern still remains in respect of domestic abuse. Like constantly, every week, there's really serious incidents are being reported. And some of these, just by their nature, many of these by their nature aren't being reported in the press. And but yet we have an awareness of this, and the amount of violence that there is pent up within our society is staggering, and how it breaks forward. And predominantly, I have to say, the victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence are either women or children, and that's an awful reality. Community safety has its part there to play in that, around the attitudes that are prevalent in our society, but there are major social ills that somehow fly under the radar, and I'd hope that community safety brings them into far more prominence.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Sorry, is that the answer you were looking for?
Well, it's quite a wide ranging, like the whole notion of community safety, I guess. But let's think about, the architecture, setting that to the side for the moment, because it will be, as it will be, and people will work partnerships and all the rest of it. But I'm thinking about, if I were living in an area that was challenged economically and socially, in a very disadvantaged area, where, as you say, there's intergenerational themes of disadvantage, however we define that, what would keeping people safe and community safety mean for that sort of community? What should it mean? What, in 5-10 years' time, Commissioner, what would your vision be for that community?
Well, I would say we're starting from a strong base in terms of relationships of all communities across Ireland in the first place, and that has been, in effect, strengthened over the last year because of the community support we've put in place and how we've supported communities through the pandemic. So, I would say, as from a policing perspective, we're starting from a good place. And through the pandemic, we've also made a concentration on organised crime groups, and a lot of that has been focused on organised crime groups involved in drugs. We've taken a huge amount of drugs and guns and indeed cash, and we've brought individuals to book around that as well. And that's not just been the work of John O'Driscoll's teams, it's also every division has its own drugs team in particular. So we've made that an emphasis really since February, March of last year. So we can deal with a lot of the symptoms of that, the antisocial behaviour and the online or the on-street dealing, etc. But we need others also to get involved in that as well, because there does need to be some other diversion for people away from this activity. And the difficulty with it is that it brings a glamour and it brings a notoriety, and in effect you are a big fish in a small pond, and we have to break just that cycle also, or that perception of what this lifestyle is as well. And so you can see that the designer wear that's worn, the particular coats, shoes and jackets and clothes that are worn, all the trappings that come from elements of criminality, all of that has to be broken in terms of those perceptions. But I can't say that Garda Síochána can do that its own. Education, youth services, local councils all need to be engaged in that as well.
And when we do engage with this civic society organisations, you know, they do tell us that as well. You know, they do talk about the partnership working. And we have heard from them, and indeed residents of many communities, some of whom are really, one might say, blighted by the daily experiences that they have of drug dealing on their streets. And we've heard some really quite harrowing stories about the impact that it has, particularly on some elderly residents who've lived there, if not most of their lives, all of their lives. And some of what we are hearing is that the guards know who these people are, not only in terms of the big fish and the successes on that disruption is recognised within communities as well, but we're talking about street dealing, the thing that disrupts people, the sorts of things that prevent families going out or letting their children go out playing on the streets. And one of the things we're hearing is that the guards aren't doing very much about it. They're not moving these people on, they're not stopping them, they're not arresting them, and it just continues as is. What would you have to say to people who live in those communities, Commissioner, in relation to their safety?
What I would say, and I think AC Cagney's on the call as well, but the where we are made aware, and we are made aware of localized problems, there we always put in place a response and an operational response, and it is and in many of these cases been a full organizational response. And I could point to the experience, particularly in DMR North Central, where, you know, the local community policing teams, backed up by divisional detectives and drugs team, but also backed up by national units as well, done a huge amount of work around just the issue of street level dealing and mid-level dealers. And what I would say around the divisional drugs units, we did anticipate that they would have a lot of success. What we didn't anticipate was actually the amounts that they would bring in terms of the seizures and the money that they're having obvious success with. But everyone in the organisation has a role around the prevention and detection of crime. And I would say that like throughout the organisation, people are committed to that. You know, members of the organisation are committed to that. And I suppose against specific areas, I would say if I had the location, I'd be able to find that this specific response has been put in place there. I think obviously you're talking to community groups. We will have talked to them as well, and we'll have specific operations in place.
And they do speak, you know, those civil society organisations do have conversations with your, you know, officers regularly. But what we're hearing is they don't see the feedback on that on their streets or in their communities. And so if those operations are being put in place, I just wonder what the feedback loop is to the folk who are having that conversation with you, and maybe in some circumstances, in risky circumstances as well for themselves.
Okay.
You know, so I suppose what I'm saying is that there's not the visibility of that sort of loop or that sort of response.
I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I you know, if I knew, I don't know the location you're talking about. So if I knew location, then we could specifically answer that point. What I've seen, and it is actually throughout the organisation, we are very well connected to the JPCs. We're very well connected to the local groups. People know themselves, know each other by first name. we've had an investment in community policing. Like we've issued 500 of the mobility devices to community policing teams, and we've issued some 120 odd vehicles specifically for community policing. So, like, over the last year, we've really invested around the equipment and making those individuals accessible to their local community. So, and there's been no deterioration in that throughout the COVID period, because one of the things we said was we wanted to be there to support communities, but also then we wanted to make sure that we were keeping the foot on organised crime gangs. I suppose that one of the difficulties we've had over the last year is for the absence of any sort of nighttime economy, people undoubtedly have turned to illicit drugs more and more, and that has driven some of our detections. And we exceeded our projected submissions to forensic science laboratory by 20% last year. So it gives an indication just of the thousands of detections that we're making for possession, but also then the thousands of detections that we're making also for supply as well.
Yeah, and I suppose that when we're all focused on ensuring that there is significant community confidence in policing, and that your involvement in the wider community safety, your responses to communities are really key to that. But one of the things we're also hearing, and this is where some of the risk may lie, is that because of that loop is not visible in terms of the information that's provided, and the visibility of your response is not seen, the people are despairing and giving up. There's a sense of hopelessness, and that would be, I imagine that's not something, it's not a place where you would want to be, Commissioner. And I suppose my last question on this, and I'm going to hand over to Stephen shortly, who's going to look at the role of community policing in this, as opposed to necessarily the drug use units, and not necessarily just in relation to drugs. But one of the key elements of this for you is the availability of local intelligence at a very, we're not talking about high level organised crime, but low level local intelligence and information provided. If I were to come to you with information, and I knew that it was a risk to me personally and my family, what guarantees can you provide me of anonymity and also keeping me safe in relation to my approach to you?
Well, that's a very general question. I think, and it covering a sort of wide range of scenarios. But when I say in the first place, there is a huge amount of information comes into Garda Síochána. We have huge connections into local communities. There's fantastic relationships, and I have to say, in terms of just tackling crime, detecting crime, we get huge assistance from the public, and that is our overwhelming experience. And information does come in, and it's acted upon. The scenario you paint to me, I find it difficult to answer when I actually don't have the specific of what the incident was or how it was dealt with. But perhaps we can further that conversation, because it's not particularly a situation that I recognise. And for instance, I know to talk about DMR North Central, where it's very terrible incident series of incidents last January, and a very close involvement in what the response was to those, and what the policing response was, and the amount of time and effort that was being put into that, but also then the ongoing connection with the community, which was strong. And I do repeat my remarks that that depth of relationship with the community has become even stronger through the pandemic because of the amount of help and assistance we gave to those who were somewhat isolated or vulnerable during that time. So we have a very strong bedrock of a relationship with the community. And if there's then a specific issue where people feel they're falling down, then we want to address that very quickly. But I wouldn't want to be in the position that you describe. I don't think it's a generalized situation. I want to address the specific in effect.
I think that AC Cagney wanted to get in earlier. I'm sorry I missed that, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Chair. And I wanted to take the opportunity just to reassure Deborah, in terms of the engagement with the communities and that feedback that you've spoken about in terms of the 360, just to reassure you, there are conversations that I'm having in the Dublin metropolitan region, you know, and part of the solution to this, and I've engaged with quite a few community reps and elected representatives, is bringing the feedback, because there's consistent number of meetings, clear information provision to our elected representatives and community representatives. But again, they have to close off that loop in terms of providing the feedback to members of the community where we're not engaging directly. So again, there's a clear commitment that that will continue and that there'll be greater efforts put into that particular space going forward. So I just wanted to clarify that for you, Chair, if that's okay.
Thanks. Thank you, Assistant
Thanks,
Commissioner.
Anne-Marie. And thanks, Commissioner, for dealing with those, I know, very generalised questions. It's been very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to ask Stephen.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, Commissioner and colleagues. Commissioner, we've heard this afternoon, in fact, you said yourself that community safety is much wider than An Garda Síochána. It's I suppose, a system-wide approach involving many partners, of which you are one, if it's to be successful. And I think the Chair in his opening remarks referred to your forward in the policing plan, in which you've said that community policing is an ethos. It's not just done by this block of officers here, but it's a philosophy. It's the way you go about things as an organisation. Would I be right in saying that whilst you expect the entire organisation to contribute to your community policing efforts, your community policing teams are right at the vanguard of that, working within communities? Is that fair to say?
In so much as it probably then underplays the work that's done in smaller towns and rural communities. And if I was only to define community policing as being the vanguard of community policing teams, I'd be doing the many hundreds of members of this service who are in effect got a dual role. You know, they respond to calls, but also have a huge sort of connection into their local community. So I suppose we have a number of tiers. We have the community policing teams in the more urban areas, cities and etc. But once you go out into rural towns and villages, etc., I would say the great majority of the policing is set in a community policing context, and the relationship with local communities is extremely strong. Probably the strongest in these islands anyway, I would say.
Yeah, so well, I don't want to underplay the contribution of officers or Garda outside of the areas that require teams. But if I can ask you then, it's really around, I want to sort of start at the basics and work up. So am I right in saying that whether they're a team or whether they're an individual Garda, that those who are involved in the core community policing role are selected for that? So all across the country, there is a nominated community policing officer for a patch of territory. In some places that'll be an individual, in some places it may be a team. Is that right?
Well, just when I was answering the question earlier about the developments in the policing plan, we were specifically rolling out that individual geographic ownership in four divisions. But certainly if you are in a single or two-person station, you own that geographic area, and pretty much they own it 24/7 in some places.
Okay, well, I certainly want to acknowledge absolutely the contribution of guards outside of the metropolitan area, but for the purpose of exploring community policing a little bit more, if we can move into an area that has a team, a community policing team, a distinct team, keen to hear how the people that end up in that team are selected or identified, and whenever they're put into that team, the sort of training that they may get to equip them, for example, in problem solving. So just keen to hear, when you're put into a team, what happens in terms of sort of nuts and bolts.
Okay, well, thank you. I might turn to Paula there, who is implementing the community policing program. So Paula, could you take that question on, please?
Certainly, Commissioner, I could. Yes, good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, Stephen. Good to see you. Yes, in terms of community policing, as the Commissioner has outlined, we have teams in the urban areas. We have other teams who perhaps in the medium density areas cover a number of towns and single Garda stations. But as the Commissioner said, there are many Gardaí outside of that who also deliver community policing. But if we look at those who we've defined under that definition then, which is maybe what you're looking at, so that definition of community Gardaí, we've identified 1,425 under that definition. Now, some of them will be already in situation. Some, for when future appointment, there is a job profile for that role, and that's part of the work we're doing. The selection of those Gardaí, however, will rest very much with local districts and divisions to appoint on their needs basis. So, yes, there is a role profile. In terms of training as well, yes, we have a training module. There was a training module aligned to the rollout of the community policing framework, and there are 5 modules in that programme. Module 1 is aligned totally to the community policing framework, but the other 4 modules which are separate to that, we are rolling out to all of our community Gardaí this year. One is about support systems, which is about, as you say, problem solving. It's the SARA problem solving model we use here, or training them in Garda Síochána. It's one you'll be familiar with. The decision making model and other models that can assist them. That's module 2. Module 3 is community engagement, which is about, as the name suggests, their stakeholder engagement, presentation skills for doing the schools programme. Many of our community Gardaí will do an established schools programme. The year before COVID, we were out into over 2,500 schools, and we have an established programme for that with set presentations for those relevant to the age of the children and young people we're engaging with. So module 3 is community engagement. Module 4 is public safety, which is all we've talked about as well. Offender management, crime prevention, vulnerability, trauma. Another thing that we're just starting to look at is ACEs, adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed practice, and how we can start looking at that in Ireland. And it's been led by TUSLA, but actually how do we then start bringing that into our policing environment? And then finally, diversity, and that's also linking into our hate crimes. Module 5 is diversity. So to summarise, number 1 is community policing, number 2 support, 3 is community engagement, 4 is public safety, and 5 is diversity. So that is all on our LMS, and we are going to start rolling that out. Initially, we'd focused on 4 pilot divisions from last year, but from this year now, we're going to look ahead of any rollout of the community policing framework, and that training will be available for all our community Gardaí. And I think that's a very positive step for them, and they can do it online. It's online training totally.
Okay. So one of the things that, Debbie alluded to this, whenever you are engaging in a community safety approach, there's a continuum of crime. You have everything from quality of life issues at one end of the continuum through to high-end, serious, complicated, organised crime, perhaps at the other end. And traditionally, police services have to do it all, but understandably, perhaps the focus can become skewed to that serious end. But I think it's well recognised that quality of life issues are really impactful on communities. So how do you, as an organisation, ensure that you're paying attention to that entire continuum? So it's this issue that Debbie alluded to. They say, communities will say, well, the guards can see this is happening, but they do nothing about it. So I'm not making a judgment about that, but that's the sort of thing that's being said. So how do you, seeing is believing, how do you make sure that your community policing teams and the efforts of the organisation are thinking about quality of life just as much as they're thinking about serious and organised crime?
Well, I think if I turn to Anne-Marie Cagney, who would have the regional Dublin metropolitan area experience of this. So Anne-Marie, could you just say how that would be managed in some of the more difficult areas for policing, please?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, Steve. Lovely to meet you. So the quality of life is probably, one of the most important aspects that we consider when we're putting our policing operations in place. If we look at the raw data, it tells you how you're trending in a particular crime area, but that doesn't reflect to perceptions of public safety. So it's really important that you have that wider understanding of the perception of public safety, and in understanding that, you have to listen to your communities. And based on that understanding, based on that knowledge base, you then put your policing operations in place. But what's important about your policing operations is they have to have both a strategic and an operational consideration. So to give you a sense of an example, Steve, if you look at my operation to deal with something like drugs-related intimidation, the approach of that operation is about quality of life as well as the most serious aspect of the drugs-related intimidation piece. So you look at your frontline awareness and increasing the awareness of that for your front responders. You look at your collaboration with your community supports, and you make sure that that's a focus of your strategy. You look at improving the effectiveness of the programme itself, the Drugs-Related Intimidation National Programme. And then you look at an analytical understanding of what the actual data is telling us in that particular area. And it's only when you have an understanding and you have an ongoing understanding of what all of the community are feeling in this space, what their feelings of fear otherwise are. And you do that through engagement on the ground, as well as engagement with a key range of stakeholders at all levels. So that's the type of approach we take to particular operations in response to the needs of the community, and that's a particularly important focus that you maintain going forward, because your operations change in accordance with the various expectations and needs of our communities.
Okay, if I can maybe just follow up with you, Anne-Marie. So we've heard the Commissioner explain the high-level vision and ethos around keeping people safe. We've heard Paula talk about the training, the continuous professional development, the theory, if you like, and you've just explained how you convert that into an operational environment. So as the owner of Dublin, if you like, from a policing perspective, today you have community policing teams operating in, say, Northeast Inner City, where there are a range of policing challenges and social and economic challenges. How do you know that everything that we've heard this afternoon is actually working and working effectively? How do you, as the AC and the owner of that, actually do your checks and balances so that you can be satisfied that all the theory we've heard is actually turning into a reality on the ground?
Thanks, Steve. And again, there are obviously, as you're aware, a couple of mechanisms for me to be able to have reassurances in place. So I have my formal mechanisms through what I call my PALF engagement with a range of stakeholders at Chief Superintendent, Superintendent rank and Detective Superintendent rank. And that's to make sure I hit both the serious crime areas and the community safety areas and the governance areas for which the chiefs are responsible. Then you have to extend it out to your engagement with your key stakeholders in the community. And that's done through forums such as the JPCs, the community safety partnerships that you're aware of, which are being in the North Central Division. And again, it's engaging at all levels and making sure you have a good sense of your impacts on the ground. And even, Steve, just to give you a sense, while normally the teams would engage with the key people within the communities, I've also extended out that connection as well, because it's important for me as a regional assistant commissioner to have that general understanding of what the issues are on the ground. Because if you're directing operations at strategic level, which I am, you need to understand what your community are feeling and whether they are feeling safe, and if they're not feeling safe, what their issues are. So to support that as well, I'm a member of a number of groups within the Dublin metropolitan areas, ranging from the business community to community representative groups, to partnerships, and all of those areas I attend personally so that I get a real sense of how we're impacting on the communities. And again, part of the governance KPIs, as you're aware, reflect to me how well we're engaging with our victims and whether we are providing that victim callback space and all of those other areas. And then just to give you a sense of all of the operations that we conduct here in the Dublin metropolitan region, we put in a regional governance oversight in here, and we make people accountable. So they have to report into me on a particular basis, whether it's bi-monthly, monthly or weekly. They're managed and operated by my chief superintendent here, who reports directly to me on how effective or not we are in certain areas.
Okay, thank you. I'm probably arriving at my final question here, Drew, just because of to keep an eye on the time. I've been asked to self-manage. So if I can ask about hate crime, maybe just something that probably be no surprise to you that I want to touch on. Could you tell me what sort of profile hate crime has within An Garda Síochána? And based on the answer to that, where you want to take An Garda Síochána in relation to its policing of hate crime, how you want to see that develop, be helpful. Thanks.
Okay. Hate crime is very obviously an issue in Irish society. We saw last week a bill published that seeks to, in effect, improve our criminal justice response to hate crime, and perceptions of our approach to hate crime within that are obviously very important. We ourselves have instigated a number of measures to improve our response, and that's in terms of recording. So our latest update in Pulse has improved our ability to report upon hate crime, and also then our Garda Information Service, then they actually provide a quality assurance around hate crime reporting. Paula there has been undertaking work around the reporting of hate crime, the understanding of hate crime, but also then its definition and the understanding of that definition, and then the training to run through. I think there is a public policy issue that we can't ignore in terms of the recording of some elements of diversity and really in effect the prohibition on some of that, how that might be done. And that's something which probably I think needs to be addressed through public policy, because that inhibits us in terms of the data and our understanding of both sort of who the victims are and who the perpetrators are as well. So we are inhibited in one way around hate crime and the overall understanding of what the strategic threat is. But we want to do what we can in the meantime, and that's about our understanding and particularly our training in respect of that. And I'll just look to Paula just to talk through the initiatives that she has ongoing at the moment in that respect, and some of the achievements as well. Paula, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, Stephen, it's an area where you and I have both worked previously, and it's very similar. Our definition here is very similar to other jurisdictions in terms of it's the perception test. So it's crime or hate incident. In Ireland, we have 9 protected characteristics that we have defined under our working hate crime definition. So we have age, disability, race, colour, nationality, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation and gender. or the 9 protected characteristics that we've identified that we will be recording hate crime and hate incidents under. That really went live. It was, the definition was published in 2010, although the perception test was and had been initially referenced here in about 2007. Last October, our computer system, Pulse, was upgraded, which allowed us to start recording hate incidents for the first time. So up to then, we hadn't been recording hate incidents. So what we're doing now for the first year, and it is on the policing plan, is this year will be a baseline for us in terms of our recording of hate crime and hate incidents. That said, you know, on a monthly basis, I always, my National Diversity and Integration team are right in the helping and supporting, doing the quality assurance at the moment around the recording and reporting, of hate crime. And we're going to do that. I didn't see that as their role long term, but to bring some assurance to this until we have all the training rolled out and are where we need to be in terms of both our call handlers being trained and our guests being trained. And that's ongoing at the minute. Briefings with them are happening virtually. And we're recording that. So we will use our baseline. In terms of the unit then, the Garda National Diversity and Integration Unit, which I'm responsible for, we have just finished the online training for our frontline and staff members. That will go out to all our members and staff, and that is about online hate crime training. It's about the definition of hate crime. It's about the perceptions, which will be new here, because the culture will be to look for evidence rather than the perception test. And then the investigation and the support of victims. That is with the college and is really ready for imminent uploading onto our LMS system. But again, it will have to be prioritised alongside other training. That's going to be supported then by 2 other modules, culture awareness and diversity training, and then leadership and diversity. So we're going to support that, and they should be rolled out. The aim is this year, because actually 2021 that's when our external diversity and hate crime strategy finishes, and we're now even starting work on our new strategy. And just finally, one of the other great enablers for this are our diversity officers. So we've 200, we did some housekeeping, 280 diversity officers across the country. We're currently looking at that. We're looking at our trends of what we can see in terms of, and actually, where there's a general training for them, some bespoke training so there are specific cultural needs in certain areas, how we can work with the local divisional officers and support them in any additional training that may be required. So that's really our high level overview of where we are with hate crime. It's certainly something, you know, there has focus and a great amount of work done in this in the last 8 to 10 months.
Okay, and probably just need a prompt answer to this one, because I think I'm getting the signs. But Paula, just on that, the cultural and diversity awareness training, who all is that being rolled out to over the passage of time? And secondly, do you use either at a corporate, regional, or local level independent advisory groups in relation to those 9 dimensions of diversity that you referred to?
Yes. So firstly, the cultural awareness diversity training is for all Garda staff and all Garda members. The leadership one is for superintendent rank and above. Yes, we have a national diversity forum, which has just been recently established. All those representative groups at a national level from our 9 protected characteristics are represented in that. As is a member of the Policing Authority, I invited in an observatory capacity. So we also are using and have sort of developed their terms of reference to be a critical friend, nearly an IIG type role. They were initially established to monitor the implementation of the framework, but actually we are, and I'm using them, and I meet them. We do meet quarterly. I meet them for the second half of the meeting. Really critical friend, using us to support us in some of our decisions, our development of policy, feedback, and also our communications, because you know yourself, there's no stronger voice than the voice of a member of the community, minority community that's being represented. So we can say report hate crime to the guards, but actually somebody from their own community is a much stronger voice for us.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. I'll hand back now to the chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Paul is going to ask a very quick question.
Yeah.
would be a very quick answer.
Okay. I think this is probably for Assistant Commissioner Cagney, and it's going back to the issue of the policing of communities in the northeast inner city. There have been a number of academic studies recently and media reports which are really quite dramatic in terms of the situation they describe in that area, and with residents describing houses acting as effectively drug supermarkets, as cars coming in, taxis coming in on a daily basis, houses of people being taken over, houses belonging to vulnerable individuals being taken over so that drugs can be dealt from there. I mean, I suppose my question, it is brief, it's an important issue, but I mean, first of all, do you accept that this is happening? And I appreciate the complexities of it. There are no easy solutions to this, but what can be done in the short term to try to improve that situation?
Thank you, Paul, for your question. And I'll go back to a matter that I presented on to the Policing Authority meeting a number of months ago. So the short-term solutions have been put in place, and that's greater visibility, a greater presence of high visibility and covert policing to prevent and detect drugs-related offences in the North Inner City. And again, just to make sure that there are a sense of dispersal of persons to other areas, we've put operations in the south central area of Dublin as well, just to make sure we address both. And then our long-term vision again goes back to we're working with Assistant Commissioner Serious and Organised Crime, and his team are assisting us in tackling the more serious criminality associated with drugs activities. And without talking about operators, just to reassure you that there has been significant progress in both areas.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all for both for questions and responses. I have to give warning that we're going to steal some time from when you expect it to be liberated, because there are three topics that we just want to ensure that we have some discussion on to conclude this afternoon's meeting. The first is in relation to the Garda Inspectorate report on anti-corruption and or counter-corruption, and Elaine is going to address this.
Good afternoon, Commissioner, and a special good afternoon to Deputy Commissioner Shauna Coxon. I think this perhaps, I'm a new member, but this is perhaps the first time that there are more female representatives of the Guards at the Policing Authority meeting than male. So
first time ever.
Yes, I'm quite happy to point that out. So as the Chair has noted, this is just a brief, a few questions on the recent excellent and thorough Garda Inspectorate report. So I leave my AC12 and Ted Hastings references for our next meeting. Commissioner, when did you receive the Garda Inspectorate report?
I would have received a draft report last summer. I think it was corresponds with them in July or August, and then the formal report probably with yourselves then just last month. And I now have a letter to go to the Secretary General just as our response to the recommendations, and then projected timelines as to the recommendations and how long they'll take to implement.
You've anticipated my next question. So your letter to the Minister will contain an implementation plan and timeline. And can you share with us any of those timelines? I accept there's 34 recommendations.
Well, I think we have obviously short and medium and long term. We had commenced work ourselves. There's work we want to just do in respect of our own policy development. I think significant for us is some legislation, and could back this up as well. So one area would be in respect of drug testing. We do think that is a risk for us as an organisation, the prevalence of drugs. And regrettably, we are seeing individuals within the organisation also falling foul of being in possession or using illicit drugs. So that's a particular risk for us, but we would like to move to the position of compulsory drug testing. That requires legislation. And another area known as lawful business monitoring, which is in effect the monitoring of our official phone system, and that's to combat the loss of information from the organisation. And that's another area where in effect, if you suspect that, you put the appropriate operation in place, and that is evidential then in terms of lawful business monitoring. So those are two particular areas which require legislation. Obviously then there were short-term pieces around resources and allocation of resources. That has been in part resolved on the 22nd of March, but we also have a housing issue and in particular IT issue as well, and that's short to medium term in particular. But they've highlighted then specific risks, and some of them are set out in respect of, for instance, prosecutions and also then driving incidents that members of Garda Síochána are involved in. And also, quite rightly, they point out that the code of ethics describes the ethical behaviour expected of Garda Síochána, members of Garda Síochána and staff. But what we need to be clear about is some of the practical behaviours then that means, and actually just creating certainty around where the boundaries are in respect of individuals' behaviours. And that's around perhaps relationships, making sure that relationships aren't abused, but also then care of personal information, etc. So I see a lot of this as actually being about creating an atmosphere which prevents this happening in the first place, but also creating an atmosphere where people understand entirely what the correct behaviour is, and it's not just perhaps confusion for them, and that they have a point of reference around what the behaviours are that they expect, or what we expect from them.
Just on that, Commissioner, you have referred to point of reference, and I think I was really struck by the report that there was a common theme around the formulation of policies internal in the Guards. I mean, you have a lovely code of ethics, you have a lovely policy on register of gifts, and you have a lovely conflict of interest policy. But the central criticism of the Garda Inspector report is that they are not enforced, that there is no implementation of the register of gifts, of the conflict of interest policy, or of the code of ethics. So perhaps it's more than a point of reference, but actually implementing all those lovely policies and legislative initiatives that are there.
And the part of the reason for having the anti-corruption unit is that then there is then an owner to ensure the compliance across the organisation against those very practical things, which are as much governance as anything that a register. That registers are properly kept and used, and I think many actual very significant problems would have been involved if it would have been avoided if we'd had those sorts of registers over the last 10 to 20 years. So it's sometimes it's the very mundane policy and practice then that you follow through on and put in place and prevent huge harm further down the line. And a lot of this is actually about getting a grip on that and the prevention and deterrence.
And just have a couple of minutes left. You've mentioned about the March redeployment of the anti-corruption unit. So what is the strength of the anti-corruption unit now, and what are the ranks of the officers that are contained within?
If I could, AC Pat Clavin should be on, and Pat will have that at his fingertips, he hopes.
So it's led by Chief Superintendent Johanna O'Leary. There are two detective superintendents. There are currently 2 detective inspectors with 1 more to follow. There are 8 sergeants and 13 Gardaí, and we've had a recent competition for Garda staff. nine were deemed suitable, 5 for deployment to the unit in the near future, and they must go through a vetting process. This was the first time that a deep vetting was conducted for an internal competition within a Garda Síochána, and you can imagine why that's so important.
So the unit is back to its full strength after COVID?
I wouldn't say it's back to its full strength. We didn't get everybody that we were supposed to get, but the people that were redeployed earlier in the year were back. We didn't get exactly everybody filled, but we're very much almost at full strength. And
when do you anticipate to be at full strength?
In the near future, depending on other operational requirements. We're obviously in the pool along with other pressing priorities, as you could imagine.
If I might answer that, in part, the next tranche for not only Pat's branch but other areas depends on the successful recruitment of 400 Garda staff to displace Garda members. So there's a couple of ducks need to get in a row here before there'll be further moves, but that's where our workforce planning is coming into play.
And in terms of workforce plan, is there any plans to ring fence the existing staff levels at the anti-corruption unit? The Garda Inspector report made reference to occasions where the staff can be redeployed to other areas. So is there a commitment within the Guards to ring fence the existing staff levels?
Well, I suppose never say never, but the commitment is like we've created this unit and we've created really from scratch, and we've deployed personnel to it, and their work is going to continue. We do see it as essential. But for instance, we didn't anticipate COVID-19 would slow it down, in effect, for 5 months. But there is a commitment to it. I sort of, I don't know that the expression ring fencing helps very much when there's such a huge sort of continuum of responsibilities and changing priorities in an organisation of this size against a huge continuum of demands, in truth. But we have made a commitment to this, and we will honour that.
And my final question relates to the Hamilton Review Group on economic crime, which I sat on with Detective Chief Super Pat Lorden. I note that the Minister for Justice has recently committed to having a review of those recommendations, and as part of that, the Gardaí were to submit, or are to submit, a plan to the Policing Authority and the Department of Justice by the end of Q2. Where are you with that?
If I could turn to John O'Driscoll there, please, in respect of that. The Economic Crime Bureau falls within John's area of responsibility.
Okay, well, the Department of Justice have asked us to nominate a person to sit on a committee to oversee the implementation of the action plan that they have put together. So I have correspondence here beside me to respond to that. And there will be a representative from the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau involved in that process to ensure that the recommendations as they pertain to the Garda Síochána are implemented. But insofar as they apply to us, it is really around the resourcing issue at the moment. And there was a recruitment campaign for personnel into the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau recently, and a tranche of personnel were assigned to the Economic Crime Bureau as an outcome of that process only recently. And there is another group that have been identified to transfer into the Bureau in the month of June. So the resource issue will be much improved, and that is the basis on which we will be able to do the additional work that will come our way, that is envisaged will come our way, that is identified within the Hamilton report.
You're on track then to have that plan submitted to the Policing Authority and the Department of Justice by the end of Q2, which is June.
Well, that's in terms of the personnel aspect of it. I'll have to examine any other issues that there are, but that is the most important issue. It's the one that's highlighted in the recommendations of the Hamilton report. So in June, yes, we will be able to say that we will have allocated a significant resource, 2 tranches of resources this year.
Thank you very much. I'll just return back to the chair.
Bob, you're muted.
It's unusually disciplined of me to have switched on the mute button. The next item is relates to an issue that arose or that was identified towards the end of last year about the cancellation of a range of 999 calls. There was some media coverage of it in December, I think, and perhaps also in February. And we've discussed it a number of times with the Commissioner and his colleagues at authority meetings in private in December and last month. Work is continuing, and it will, of course, be the subject of detailed discussion at a future public meeting. But we thought it was appropriate to have a brief reference to it at a public meeting, and this is the first such opportunity, simply so that there is an awareness that the issue exists and of how it's being dealt with. And Commissioner, you might offer some response, or whomsoever you wish, in relation to that.
Okay, so in very broad terms, we have a period from 2019 until October 2020, where we have through our audit process discovered that some 999 calls, and we're not in a position to provide an exact number, may in effect have been cancelled without a policing response. And what we seek to do, what we've sought to do then, is to identify all of those calls, and that has involved both a localised approach and in each regional control room looking at all specific incidents, and that also means drawing up or pulling up the actual recording of the 999 call, and then any subsequent radio transmissions and records that may exist either on the CAD system or the Pulse system. And so we're going through each of these calls in turn to see what remedy we may need to put in place. That's ongoing, and at the same time then our colleagues in ICT are also making sure that that is complete by doing in effect a macro search of the system to give us the definitive numbers of calls that might be involved. So this is work that's ongoing. We've committed to keeping the authority fully informed in respect of this, but there's still probably 2 to 3 months work engaged in this as yet.
Can I ask you if you could say something about how satisfied you are that the issues that gave rise to the problem are not recurring and will not recur? Well, this came apart from an analysis of just the implementation of our dispatch system known as a CAD system. And that in effect uncovered a systemic issue in respect of how 999 calls may be cancelled. That has been resolved, and calls can only now be in effect cancelled, and there are legitimate reasons for cancelling calls under the supervision and approval of a supervisor. So in effect, no more calls are being added into this, and we're being careful to make sure that that is actually the case, that in effect the issue is not getting any bigger. Might it be helpful just for general understanding on the part of those either from the public or from the media who are having access to this, if you could identify the types of occasions when it is proper to cancel a call? Well, often one might have an incident and say if there's a bad road traffic collision on a motorway or in the M50, one will receive numerous 999 calls, or else we might receive a call which is erroneously directed to us, and some other agency then may have been responsible
for the response. So it may be that we take a call and ultimately that would go to fire service or ambulance service or some other service then who would respond to that. We're very conscious about 999 calls that are in effect maybe silent calls, and we do listen to those, do determine in case there may be some issue in respect of that in effect somebody has rang 999 but is unable to speak, and so those are listened to and to determine is there any, in effect we're listening to the background noise, see if there's any requirement for police and response, and if not then those two would be cancelled. But we're making sure that's only been done after proper examination and supervision of that. So there are reasons legitimately why a 999 call in effect is cancelled in terms of no response. But what we're concerned about here is that 999 calls were cancelled erroneously and with not then a policing response that would have been expected.
Which I suppose brings me to the final point at this stage in this particular reference to it, that by definition people make 999, well, people who properly make 999 calls make them because of the seriousness of a situation in which they find themselves, and therefore this is by definition a potentially serious issue. When do you have a sense that you might have a full understanding of that, so that we can have a more comprehensive discussion about it in the public forum?
Well, we'll have I would trust that we'd have a far fuller understanding of this in time for the June meeting. It may not be entirely complete, but at least by that stage we should have enough information that we're able to extrapolate out what the actual lessons are, but also what the issues are, and give some quantum as to that.
Thank you, Commissioner. The final item on the agenda, for which we have, as I say, we'll steal some time, is your monthly report, which we don't want to overlook. And Donal, I think, is going to lead on this. Right, there he is.
Okay, thanks, Chairman. Thanks, Commissioner. Thank you for your report. Lots of very positive developments in the report. So the first thing to say is well done. One of the things that really stood out for me is that the trust in the Gardaí is at 83%, which is a remarkable number in my judgment. It's twice the trust in the media, and it's well ahead of business and government. Okay, so I suppose the question for the future is, say we segment that and look at, say, particular categories like younger people and minorities. I think it would be useful and interesting to see what the measurement is in those categories, because those are very important segments for recruitment. And it may hopefully it be borne out. So that's just a comment. The other thing that struck me in the report is, while overall spending is in budget, overtime is 10% over profile due to COVID, and that's understandable. Now, in some individual cases, it seems very high, and my concern is that when people are tired, they make mistakes. And that's can be a real issue in the health service and also in the policing service, because policemen have very significant powers. Do you have a system to guard against, excessive fatigue or excessive working hours for people? And say, how do you manage compliance with the EU Working Time Directive? That's my. Is that an issue?
Yes, well, in terms of excess hours and in respect of overtime, so I would receive in respect of each roster an analysis of those individuals in effect who were working long hours and what the last 3 rosters had been before that as well, and then individually, then those cases are raised with their respective chief superintendents to bring their working hours back into line with the European Working Directive. The European Working Directive is restrictive on the amount of overtime that can be worked, but at least we are an organisation which provides rest and provides also for annual leave. Particular difficulty we have at the moment is a lot of annual leave remains untaken because of just the events of last year, and people really last year a lot didn't get their quota of annual leave, nor were able to avail of it, because at times we had to hold the organizational resilience at certain levels that leave was not permitted, particularly at times when COVID-19 was meant that a lot of individuals were either ill with COVID-19 or not available because they were self-isolating. So we've had a difficult year, and the European Working Time Directive can be set aside when you find yourself in an emergency scenario. And in March of last year, I declared that we were in an emergency scenario. But again, this is one of the tales that we're going to have to deal with over the next 24 months to 30 months, really, in terms of people and the leave that they're due, and making sure that, as you say, people are properly rested and we get a control again on overtime working.
Okay. Chairman, we're in industry time, so I'm going to hand over to Valerie.
Thank you, Donald.
Afternoon again, everybody, and welcome to new members. And looking forward to working with you in the future. I just have a very quick question, actually. You mentioned there earlier, Commissioner, the implementation of the Schengen system, which is ahead of schedule in terms of implementation and training. So well done. It's sometimes we don't give enough attention to the good news. I just thought it might be useful for members of the public or journalists listening if you gave a short explanation on what this achieves in terms of community safety, and particularly then how it will operate in the context of broadening of travel or lifting of travel restrictions and changes brought about by Brexit, if any.
Well, we're still within the common travel area, so the Schengen system really is then for the rest of the EU. The UK is no longer part of the Schengen system, but we're waiting for developments on that front between the UK and the EU. I suppose for us, and we are a country where a lot of people travel in and out, and where we have a lot of people come to work here as well. It means that we're connected to the rest of Europe's police services around those who are wanted or maybe fugitives from justice there, but also then we can make other European countries aware of those who are wanted or fugitives from justice from Ireland. And that's available in effect to the patrol officer on the ground at 2 a.m. We staff our Schengen office 24/7, so that should there be any such sort of identification or hit, then we're able to identify or deal with that immediately and make contact with the other state where the interest might be, or indeed receive inquiries from other states should they find an Irish national or any national that we have a particular criminal justice interest in. So this is very important in respect of serious crime, and it really inhibits the movement of those who've been engaged in serious criminality, and for them to allow them to pop up in a different country and in effect stay under the radar. If we have dealings with them and we conduct a check on our own systems, then part of that is the Schengen check, and then that gives us a strike as to where they might be. But even on its very first day, a routine check identified an individual who's wanted for very serious crime here, and they were in custody in another European country, unbeknownst to us. And we've had a series of successes since then, and also it provides a very secure way of communicating with other police services throughout Europe in terms of information and intelligence. So it is very significant.
How do you actually collect the data?
Well, we're connected in effect to this sort of huge secure network, and what the Schengen system, and this is why it's such a significant achievement, what the Schengen system, to to be able to get onto the Schengen system, we had to like re-architecture and redesign, rebuild our system so that the Schengen system could talk to it. And so each country in turn has had to create their internal police system and has an ability to talk to the Schengen system, and the Schengen system then transfers the information on in the very broadest and simplest of terms.
For the ordinary person out there who's planning to take their private jet or a flight or a ferry to France or somewhere else, how do you get that data?
Border Force would have access to the same data as well, and just the if a border check was conducted, not necessarily that these matters are automatic, but if a border crime type check was conducted or person check, then that would throw up the same sort of hits through the Schengen system.
And I suppose the very basic question for anybody listening out there, is it from the passport control system, or how do you track the ordinary person?
This isn't a tracking system as much as an inquiry system.
Okay.
So we need to have a rationale for, so it's not a mass movement sort of surveillance system. This is focused on individuals that we have a investigative or intelligence interest in.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much for that clarification. And back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. One, to indulge, if the chair is allowed to indulge himself, one final very quick question. The public attitude survey will not, as we understand it, include 16 to 17-year-olds. Is there a particular reason why that is so? It's an age group whose views would be really valuable to know. Is it an economic consideration, or is it the issue that they're children under the law?
I'm not sure. I saw that report within our own performance report, but is any of my colleagues can assist?
I don't see Andrew. We can pick it up again, Commissioner.
Yes, please. Because
sorry, I didn't realise that Andrew had gone.
Yeah, we hope to restart it obviously very soon, and so, but we'll get that question answered.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and all of your colleagues. I hope that DC Coxon found it encouraging and informative. Thank you all very much, and thank you, colleagues, also. That the meeting is now over.
Thank you.